So I just want to thank you all for coming out, even given the weather. And welcome to our next talk in our series, Conversations with the Past. Tonight, we are excited to host Lori Soderlin for her talk on the grain silos in Buffalo, New York. Lori is a lecturer in the English department at Skidmore College. She is also the author of the book, The Change, My Great American Post-Industrial Midlife Crisis Tour, from which this talk has been extracted. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Lori.
I have permission to speak to you unmasked, and I appreciate that. That's all right with all of you, so that you can hear me. I'm really excited and happy to be here. I'm glad you guys are not afraid of a little snow. I'm starting out by making a point of saying that I am a lecturer in the English department, not the history department. And before I started this position this year, I was director of a MFA creative writing program. So my expertise is writing. I'm a writer. I'm a storyteller. I'm going to give you this talk tonight from the perspective of research I did for a book project. And I brought the book because anybody who has a book always brings books with them. That's what they do. I'm going to stick to my script so that I can go through the slides and tell you the story of what got me interested in this and what I learned about it. And I'm looking forward to a conversation with all of you afterwards, because I know we have some people who are Buffalo experts in the room, and I would love to hear what you have to say. You can fact check me as we go along. So I'm here to tell you what I know about the grain elevators in Buffalo, New York, which comprise a surreal post-industrial landscape that's similar to many old factory towns or old railroad towns or old mill towns, right, in this country that I'm interested in. But it's also wonderfully unique. These grain elevators, which are large mechanical structures comprised of silos, and the silos are the individual cylinders in the elevator. They're unlike any of the many other places with important industrial pasts that I've seen. And before I talk about these grain elevators and the silos, I want to give you a little context for my interest in them and for my interest in Buffalo generally. So in 2013, I set out to take a trip around the country with my dog Colby, looking at odd abandoned places. They're the sort of places that no one else I know had ever really wanted to go. And I mean post-industrial places mainly, but more generally, I mean changed places. Places that were something once that they aren't anymore, and that have struggled to recover their sense of what or why they are, why they exist. These are post-population shift places, places that have lost significant population over the years. They're post-big box retailing places, particularly out in the Midwest. The dominance of Walmart or big box stores has killed little towns. So now that those towns are empty. They call them historic town centers all over the country now. I just call them towns, but it's the piece of the town that's in the middle of the big box sprawl. Countless such half or wholly empty towns and cities dot the map, and I'm endlessly curious about them. A Buffalo website I like uses the expression monuments of vanished prosperity. So I flipped it, but that picture was a monument of vanished prosperity. They use that to describe the remains of the old grain industry in Buffalo. But that expression kind of applies to what I'm generally interested in, monuments of vanished prosperity. So I planned a trip to go see those places and to learn about why so much of the country looks like it's fallen into ruins. It seems obvious to me now, but I really didn't understand the big picture behind all of this when I started looking. So I took a trip with this inquiry as my guide, and I started on the Erie Canal, because I know almost nothing about it, and it's practically in my backyard. But it turns out that this is absolutely the right place to start to understand the way our industrial past developed, because the canal opened up the continent beyond the Allegheny Mountains, and it changed everything, making it possible to move goods and people in large quantities in both directions. So it sent settlers over the mountains and it brought goods from the west back east. This is not something I learned in school. We only learned the Erie Canal song in school. We left it at that. I really don't know anything beyond that until I took this trip. It was a great industrial production, like engineering piece that I'm looking for, but I didn't understand the way it opened up the country and changed everything. So I camped at St. Johnsville on the canal my first few nights out. And it was a small enough place that, like most people, even in New York, don't know St. Johnsville. But it's also typical of the towns and the cities, both large and small. We were just talking out front about Syracuse a little bit. These places sprouted up along the Erie Canal when it was opened in 1825, all across the state. This is more St. Johnsville. Textile mills and factories and industries of all kinds grew up on the canal because it was a revolutionary and fast path to move goods. Those places continue to exist, but like St. Johnsville, they're really kind of grim places now. Their industries have been lost. The canal is no longer relevant. So that's the story of Buffalo, a city that I never quite understood because everyone makes fun of it for being cold and remote. So I wondered why it exists at all if no one wants to live there. I'm a newspaper person. I used to work at the Times Union in Albany before I switched into academic and teaching. As a newspaper person, I knew that Buffalo had a great newspaper, the Buffalo News. But great newspapers happen because cities are big enough to produce them. It's not the other way around. A city doesn't grow up around a great newspaper. City comes first. And I didn't understand why Buffalo was so big to begin with. What made it so big? Why was it such an important place that a president was assassinated there? When is the last time a president actually went to Buffalo? And that is the McKinley Monument. And I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe McKinley was the last president who visited there. Well, I guess it's been 120 years. We can almost laugh about it. So the thing is that Buffalo is surrounded by water. The Erie Canal ends there, and Lake Erie begins there. Meaning that after 1825, a water route ran right through Buffalo, connecting everything that was to everything that would be. And as the canal brought more people and more goods and all that stuff, all the stuff people needed to expand the West, moving things to the lakes and then out to what we call the Midwest, but was just the West then. In a short time, the farms in the Midwest started to get big. Industrialized, really, growing from subsistence farms or small family enterprises to massive grain producers, big enough to become global grain providers. And how did they move all the grain they grew out to the world? Well, they put it on ships that crossed the Great Lakes back to Buffalo. Those ships unloaded into sheds that eventually were mechanized and called grain elevators. And with efficiencies and machinations, the elevators fed grain into humongous silos that eventually could hold millions of bushels of grain. This grain landed in Buffalo, and then it was reloaded into barges that shipped it out on the Erie Canal to the eastern seaboard, down to Albany, down the river, into New York Harbor, and out to the world. So stop to think about this for a moment. The great big bread basket of the American Midwest, the Great Plains, produces a lot of grain, a lot of grain. When you move it, you got to store it somewhere. And this is what made Buffalo one of the 10 largest cities in the country for decades. Books I read on this, and there's some wonderful local authors and local books on the subject. They say that at its peak, 700 million bushels of grain moved through Buffalo annually. In the years just before World War II. And I have trouble thinking about how big 700 million bushels is. 100,000 bushels apparently weighs 3,000 tons. I did a little math and I found out that that's 21 million tons of grain moving through, but those numbers are just like, I guess that's a lot. I mean, it sounds like a lot, but the way you really get to see how much it is by looking at pictures that I'm going to start showing you of these grain silos in the elevators. So the need to move more grain led to innovation, and then innovation spurred more production. And the first ward of Buffalo, down by the Buffalo River, was built entirely around this industry. And the immigrant labor worked the docks there, and people showed up in Buffalo just for the jobs. It's hard to imagine thousands of workers on the waterfront where there's nothing living but ducks and deer today. That's today, some geese swimming up the Buffalo River. You can see there's trains behind there. Let me go back to, let me see. I'll look at that historic one again. So it's hard to imagine thousands of workers on the waterfront where there's nothing but ducks and deer today. That is an old grain elevator, pictures around the 1930s, and it shows up again in my slideshow. That elevator is gone now. All the ones that are not made of concrete, with one exception, are gone now. But the whole riverfront was just lined with these. And oops. There's nothing but, there's nothing. There's no very few humans in that area at all. So the grain was first unloaded by hand in bushel sacks into these storage farms. And it would take a week to unload a ship into the silos by hand that way. So this led to the innovation of the grain elevator, which is one of the great Buffalo innovations. Joseph Dart invented the grain elevator in Buffalo in 1842 using a large mechanical bucket, a vertical conveyor belt really, and was steam powered, to move grain up from the ship holds and dump it into storage facilities. So this is concrete silos that I'll be talking about shortly, but it's a good picture of a present building that has an elevator on it. So the silos are the concrete part, and the square structures are the elevators, and they would take, they'd load the grain into those and dump the grain into the bins, right? So we'll talk about the innovation of those silos in a minute, but it was the elevators came first, and they were on that historic picture that we were looking at. They had a grain elevator that brought it up into the storage shed. In any case, the elevators were what really expanded the Buffalo port's capacity to move grain. By the time of the Civil War, there were so many elevators constructed and so much grain capacity that Buffalo was the largest grain port in the world. So, and it stayed that way for a long time. And one of the largest ports generally, but it was really grain that was its product because it was all coming from the Midwest. So there are wonderful small books on this, and there's a museum in the first ward in Buffalo. Here's that picture again. I owe thanks for dates and facts and figures to a website that I really rely on heavily. It's a wonderful small website. It's not fancy. It's buffaloh.com. So Buffalo H is in history. And there's a series of articles on there by a SUNY professor, Francis Kowski. So, I want to give a shout out again. I'm a writer who became interested in these subjects generally and have researched mostly secondary sources and articles written by other scholars. And I've been to this wonderful museum, first ward in Buffalo, and looked at what they have. I don't have a lot of historic photos to show you though, because I don't want to infringe on their copyrights. Most of the pictures I'll be showing you are just pictures I took on my trip when I was researching the book. So in any case, the elevators, once they started, led to increased storage needs. Because they were moving so much grain faster, right? So the next problem was that wood wasn't a particularly safe way to store huge quantities of grain. There were a lot of fires and there were rodents and other problems. So steel was next, and this is the Great Eastern grain elevator, and it was a steel structure. And it had steel bins inside. But it wasn't great help against fire, and there's only, my notes tell me there's only one steel elevator that does remain on the river from that era. It's I think it's the Great Northern. I think it might be in my notes later. We'll see. But the point is that the wood ones and the steel ones went away. They got destroyed, and they were all replaced by concrete. So that's one other sort of picture for you. I particularly like that one. I think it's also from the 30s because, I mean, it's not a great quality photo, but it has that industrial feel to it. If you look down on the far left, you see that there's concrete silos starting to rise, and these are steel. You can see the cylindrical steel bins. So this is like the new stuff is coming and the old stuff is going out, and it's got this really gritty, grungy, you know, it doesn't even feel like a river, you know, it just feels like a industrial passage, seaway. And of course, they were, the ships are letting off exhaust, and the elevators are letting off a lot of exhaust, so I'm sure the air quality was pretty rough working conditions for people in the first ward. But that's what it's like to live in an industrial neighborhood, right? So concrete was fireproof, and it kept rodents and insects out better than wood or metal. But it couldn't be used until architects devised a way to pour enormous concrete tubes. So the concrete silos that are what we see all along the river today came along at the start of the 20th century, making this part of Buffalo the concrete corridor that it is now. And those structures, they're not going anywhere. They were built to last. And the method that they were built with was one long concrete pour with a form that would slide up it as the concrete was setting. And it took about 10 days to pour a silo of 125 feet in height, which is the typical height in Buffalo. This is called the slip form method of constructing concrete cylindrical silos. And they're all bound together into grain elevators. And the very first one was made in Buffalo in 1906 as part of the American elevator. This is the American elevator. And so these would be the first concrete silos created in this country. And, you know, you can go anywhere in the world now and see these kind of concrete cylindrical grain silos, and you know that it started in Buffalo. And that's my dog, Colby. So the American elevator stands today in a section of the riverfront called Silo City, which is going to figure into my story in a moment. So before the World War, Buffalo had 38 functioning grain elevators with the capacity to move 47 million bushels of grain in their mostly concrete silos. I still kind of can't quite grasp how much grain that is, but when I look at all of those tubes and I think about them being full, I kind of get the idea. So I kayaked up this river and I took a lot of pictures. It's wonderful, I think, to think about all those ships moving up the river to dock at the elevators. We cover miles and miles of the riverfront. The Cargill is one of the elevators that's, they're all abandoned. Well, actually, I think there's 3 still operating, although one was the Lake and Rail, and I understand that might have closed, so they're down to 2. Cargill's is a pretty well-known one because everybody can see its name. So they cover miles of waterfront. It's a long corridor. It must have been really busy back when people were working there and scooping grain and, you know, running the business, and then moving it onto trains and moving it out. The names of these elevators are familiar to first word Buffalonians, like the way in Colorado you can name a mountain range. You know, they can just look at them and tell you that's the Perot Towers or Marine or the Nesbitt or H&O or Great Northern or Concrete Central or Cargill, March, Sturgis, Spencer Kellogg. Any of the elevators on acre after acre abandoned silos all the way up the Buffalo River for miles. This is a warehouse, actually, not a grain silo, and it's just a way of reminding us that, of course, there were many things that were shipped via canal and had to wait it out in Buffalo. So there's a galaxy of storage buildings and shipping-related buildings all along the water, not just silos, but other types of buildings as well, and they're abandoned. Buffalo had loads of bakeries for a time and some breweries, Genesee Brewery and other breweries up there because it had so much grain that was readily available. There's some abandoned malt roasting facilities at a beer maker. Some malt was brought here and they made beer here. So shipping anything was a way to get rich for a long time, probably still is. It's how John D. Rockefeller got rich. He started working as a shipping merchant in Cleveland on the Great Lakes. But then he got wind of oil and trains and he started the Standard Oil Company and became a billionaire. Now Rockefeller really doesn't have anything to do with Buffalo, except that his understanding of how trains were about to alter the landscape was his real genius, and he used trains to gain a monopoly in the oil industry. And trains, of course, meant the beginning of the end for the Erie Canal. These are some train tracks that would have gone in and out of the silos. And it's really kind of cool. I think I have a picture later on that you can see with the bottom underneath those silo tubes is an area where train carts or other types of carts would go and the grain would come down through those tubes into a large steel hopper and get loaded right onto trains or into containers that would go out on barges. So there's a lot of abandoned train tracks all around these buildings too. So like I said, the trains came along and the Erie Canal starts to become irrelevant, but Buffalo stayed relevant because it ships, you're still loading and unloading there. And they just unloaded on the trains instead of barges. And so there's a lot of beautiful infrastructure, train drawbridges all up and down this river. There's my clients. So anyhow, there are a lot of railroads that start or end in Buffalo. You know that if you play Monopoly, Buffalo Railroad is one that you end up buying on the Monopoly board. Anyhow, what really killed the grain industry on the river and what thus really killed this iteration of Buffalo was the St. Lawrence Seaway. The St. Lawrence Seaway opened in 1959, and that made Buffalo no longer critically important as a place to stop when you're shipping. So all the shipping traffic that comes from the Great Lakes across Lake Erie, and you can see Buffalo right under the Welland Canal around the center of that slide. You could go in, the Welland Canal was there, you could get into Lake Ontario, but until the St. Lawrence Seaway was started, which I can't quite point to, but hopefully you can see where that darkened line is. Before that opened up and connected the Great Lakes to St. Lawrence River, there was no way for ships to just go directly out to the ocean, and now they can, and that's what they do. Stop and unload. So that was 1959, and incidentally, the 60s through the 80s, that is the period of post-industrial or deindustrialization in this country. After the 1980s, from around 1990 until now, ongoing, these industries that had grown up and been so huge in the country, things changed, and all that changed to happen right around the same time for various different reasons. But this happened in 1959, and it's right around the same time that family-owned businesses were going global and being bought up by large conglomerates, and a lot of different pressures on the economy happened around that time. Buffalo, the main problem was simple, and it was this. And the abandonment was swift and thorough. And it's really astonishing, actually, to think of how quickly it happened. In 1960, there were still all those functioning grain silos and elevators, and it was also important for so long. And then the shipping situation changed, and all the innovations that had come and gone in Buffalo just didn't matter anymore. And population left, about half the size, the city is about half the size that it was at its peak. People in the preservation world talk about right sizing. They say, okay, well, the city needed to be a certain size at a certain time. What is its right size now? And this is what Detroit is going through, of course, right? You know, people have left and neighborhoods have been abandoned, and they've decided to raise whole neighborhoods in Detroit. Buffalo isn't quite like Detroit, but there are parts of it that feel that way, and then there are parts of it that feel wonderful. So the question is, what's the right size for Buffalo? All this industrial stuff is really beautiful. There are still 3 functioning elevators in Buffalo, although I think it might be 2 now that Lake and Rail is gone. They make Cheerios at General Mills, and they process grain in other ways in Buffalo now, but this is the key. They make things, they bring grain there and they make things. So a couple of elevators remain for people who use grain for industries that stayed in Buffalo. But the death of Buffalo really as an important shipping hub is what made most of the elevators obsolete and what changed the city so quickly. So what's happening to these huge structures today? So that is that's my trailer in my car. And there's the American elevator again, the first one. You can tell because it's speckled, it looks a little different. So I went and I camped out in this place. I camped in a section of riverfront that's called Silo City. Let me say before I go there that these silos, back up a little bit, I'm sorry. Within 25 years of the St. Lawrence Seaway opening in the 1980s, the first rumblings to tear these things down began. People were like, well, we don't need them anymore, and they're ugly, and they're an eyesore, and we could reclaim the river, tear them down. But it cost millions of dollars to rip down like each individual collection of silos. It's not easy to do. They were really built to last. So the silos were really important to architects for a while. From the moment they were built, they had an influence on like people thought these structures were beautiful in a way even before they were abandoned. They're curiously beautiful now. There are architects all over the world, including the brutalists, right? Who the brutalist movement in the 1950s thought that poured concrete was beautiful. So this is the National Theatre in London, and places like this, they say are derived from those concrete silos. People thought, well, we ought to save them because they're important historically. In any case, I camped in a section of the riverfront called Silo City on my book trip. It was really the first big stop on my trip, and I would have really liked to have just stayed there for the whole. I was going to be gone 3 months, and I decided I'll just stay here because this is interesting. But I stayed a week. I got to start on my project there, and when I was there, there was this Wild West feeling to this place called Silo City that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about, because the historians have been saying that this place mattered for decades, but it took until about 2013 or later for people to begin to understand what to do with miles of industrial structures. And they had just kind of decided, you know what, we're going to buy these up and we're going to do some cool stuff. And I was there just when it started. I'm sure that I don't think they would have let me camp there if I showed up this past summer. But when I showed up in 2013, this is Silo City. The owner of the acres of elevators that's known as Silo City in Buffalo is a native. He's a Buffalo native and a businessman. His family owns a metal fabrication company 3 generations just down the road from this little peninsula that has a collection of grain elevators and other buildings on it. And he bought this collection because he's a businessman and he'd been thinking he would put an ethanol plant here. But that fell through. So he's a businessman, he's got to find something else. He doesn't want to just own a peninsula of grain elevators. So like many American places, they're looking to make their industrial economies now. The most viable option seemed to be entertainment. People in Buffalo love coming to the silos. Buffalo hipsters have flocked to this place. Sort of the same way that, if you know a little about hipster culture, they all started drinking Pabst beer 20 years ago. They like, there's this thing in hipster culture where they like old industrial stuff, the authenticity of it. They like Pabst beer, even though it's now owned by a conglomerate that's actually owned by a Russian guy. Still, it's Pabst beer. It's American libations. That's what we drink. It's the idea of the things, in other words. But anyhow, they love the silos for similar reasons. In the 2000 teens, there were numerous arts festivals at Silo City, including one recurring event called the City of Night, which is a play on the word City of Light, which is Buffalo's nickname. During which, in the City of Night, they put in art installations all through the silos that people could wander through, and musicians recorded in the silos. The acoustics are amazing in these places. Films have been shot there. There've been candlelit poetry readings that draw huge crowds. You know, anything arty is working for them in this place. But if you talk to Rick Smith, that's not gonna do it for him. But I'll tell you what Rick has in mind for this particular bunch of buildings. When I walked through the elevators at Silo City, I saw the remains of all these art projects completely out of context in the pits of this mechanical wreckage. I'd turn a crumbling corner and find a painted deer staring out from the wall, or a string of lanterns floating from a bed, or a hammock surrounded by candles. In one warehouse, I encountered a mural of a ballet dancer that was so realistic that I thought it was actually somebody doing yoga in the studio. But it was just a painting. So in 2013, we started tearing out the hoppers in the grain elevators known as Marine A, where many of these art installations are. These tractors and blowtorches, and we started pulling these out. I mentioned these earlier when I was talking about the trains. You can see, actually, this is not a mural painting. That's a trick of the eye. It's actually a long corridor of space, and you can kind of see how it's hopper after hopper. And so all of those concrete tubes landed on these steel hoppers that could be opened and then could dispense grain to train carts or whatever and be hauled away. So they pulled all of those out, and they just made these huge open tubes. And they were turning Marine A, which is one of the elevators in Silo City, they were trying to put a rock climbing center in it. And the highest outdoor climbing structure in the Western Hemisphere. This is a guy named Jason, who's all these guys who are like entrepreneurial. They're like, we know how to make money. We're gonna put a climbing studio in here, and everybody's gonna come and do their rock climbing. I'm pretty sure the rock climbing deal has fallen through, but Jason was pretty excited about it when I was there. They put these folds on, and people would just climb up the thing. Apparently, this would be higher than the existing highest climbing structure in the Western Hemisphere, which is in Brazil. I think, in Brazil. So they were excited about that, but I don't think that worked out because I can't find it anywhere. And I know I can pick up the phone and find out that way, but I sort of don't want to. There is a restaurant and a wedding venue there. And it happened that when Colby and I were camped out there, there was a wedding that came through. A lot of people like their wedding pictures taken around the silos of Buffalo. So, and they didn't seem to mind Colby tagging along. I read that in the summer of 2022, they expect to turn the American elevator, that one with the first poured concrete silo, into high-end riverfront housing, which seemed inevitable because Rick Smith is a businessman, and he didn't buy this land as a curiosity. He's looking for ways to develop it. So inevitably, this is what people do on old industrial structures. In Akron in the 70s, somebody turned the old General Mills silos into a hotel. So there's precedent for it. They're going to try and turn these silos into housing that's supposedly gonna start or open in next year. I don't know if there's enough demand for that kind of housing in Buffalo, but we can try. Nothing can really match, I think, the particular majesty and glory of an industrial past. And as I understand this more deeply, I'm going to tell you about the dog and stuff in a second. But as I understand all this a little more deeply, I also understand there's a lot of grief around the loss of this industrial past in this country. And I think that was the purpose of my trip. That was ultimately my inquiry. I wanted to find out about all these abandoned places and why they're abandoned, but like who lives there, and who are they, and why are they there? And I do understand. It was 2013 when I made that trip, and I sort of learned something about much of, if not most of, our country. The space out there is filled with these places, and people are feeling the loss of those places. But the other thing that I've come to understand as I've studied these places is that while it's really wonderful to look backwards at what incredible things we're capable of, it's people like Rick Smith who are trying to look forward to the next thing that are going to actually help places like Buffalo remake themselves and become something new. It might look like the past because we can't seem to tear the silos down. But other than looking like the past, the economy will be something different. And the people who can understand what it will be are going to be the winners. So I have about 10 minutes that I was going to talk for another 10 minutes. And then I would really love to open this up to discussion and hear your thoughts. Many of you have probably been to or maybe come from such places. But before I do that, I'm going to use my last 10 minutes to read a little bit from my book, The Change, about camping in the silos in Buffalo. So I'll show you these pictures again. This is the dog Champ sitting outside of the shack where a guy named Swanee Jim lives. And Swanee Jim is the overseer of Silo City, and he is a really great guy. I spent a lot of time, the week I was there, I spent most of my time sitting around the fireplace with him and a bunch of guys who show up regularly along with some architecture students from the University of Buffalo. We watched the Bills game that day. I captured the moment on this little 10-inch television. It was awesome. In Swanee Jim's shack, and I captured the moment in like the last moment of the game when they got the victory touchdown. And they're a really good bunch of people. This is Swanee Jim to the right, who lives on site, and now this guy named Kevin who figures into the story that I'm going to tell you now. Book, and then of course is Mr. Colby, who is no longer with us, but he made it through this trip. So rest in peace. So this is from the Buffalo chapter of my book. Jason, the kayak guy who you saw a picture of, had asked Swanee Jim to watch for me because I decided I needed to camp somewhere, and there's no campsites anywhere near Buffalo. So I was trying to figure out where I was going to stay. Jason, the kayak guy, asked Swanee Jim to watch for me. And when I pulled up to his shack with my trailer, Jim approached my car with his pit bull, Champ. Champ's face was fawn colored with almond eyes and a leafish black nose. Jim's face was thin and rough like worn red leather with a stubble of white whiskers. His eyes, squint thin through square glasses, were deeply creased in the corners. He looked like he'd spent a fair amount of time working outside in the sun or on ships in bad weather or in Buffalo. Do you think it's safe to camp here? I asked through my cracked open car window like a barephobic tourist at the gates of Yellowstone. Most Silo City veterans would have been appalled by this question, but in my defense, it really was an abandoned industrial site, accurately described as a creepy, deserted brownfield at the edge of a poor and sometimes violent city. Later, pictures I posted on the internet drew speedy and satisfyingly worried responses. My father was following my travels via social media, and when I reached Buffalo, he urged me to please stop advertising my location to would-be murderers. My favorite comment came from a friend back home who, upon seeing pictures of my trailer squatting in a field of scrap metal and splintery debris, wrote to say, Remember, palm to the nose, knee to the groin, palm to the nose, knee to the groin. Jessica, my partner at the time, issued a supportive comment, the kind of thing a partner often offers when arguing is pointless. Be careful, she wrote me as I slipped into the glorious, hard, and strange place. Don't get hurt, she said. In my idling car, I craned my neck to size up the silo clusters rising from the dirt near and far. The ground was barren and the wind blew endlessly. Silo City seemed to be an unconstructed war zone. Swanee Jim, a man I had known less than a minute who apparently lived in a shack, assured me I would be safe there. We don't get a lot of trespassers, he said. Champ snapped at the end of her rope. Colby was whining to get out of the car, which could have meant grave danger was imminent or that he had to pee. Odds were on pee. I told Jim we would stay. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, just read a little bit more about this group of guys that I met at the silos. I don't want to take too much time there because I really would love to hear from you. Jason, the kayak guy, explained the rise and fall of the grain industry to me and showed me where the new yoga studio would go. And then he left me and Colby to enjoy our dinner of salad and kibble on a riverside loading dock. University of Buffalo crew skulls shot up along the river through Elevator Alley in their evening workout, then disappeared beyond the bend. I was walking Colby back to the trailer in the dimming light when Swanee Jim, who was standing outside his shack smoking a cigarette, called me over. You've been talking to the wrong people, he said. This worried me. Jason had seemed so nice, so excited about Silo City and its history and the, quote, responsibility good people have to the ghosts of this place, close quote. Which actually he did not say. I said this thing about responsibility and ghosts, and I swooned, and he nodded profoundly. But Swanee Jim said if I really wanted to know about the silos, I had better follow him. He chained up his dog, then Colby and I entered the shack, and there, sitting around the stove on a collection of broken chairs in the bad light, were Rick Smith, Bob the Builder, Kevin the Horse Thief, whose nickname had a witty anecdote behind it that Kevin liked to tell, but that I never quite understood. Didn't matter. The names gave the gatherings a kind of tribal feeling. Someone handed me a beer and offered me a chair, and then Bob leaned way back on the busted springs of his seat and said, so, you've come here to learn. What do you want to know? All eyes watched carefully as if this were a sacred riddle. I wasn't sure how to put it. What had I come to learn, really? I could have said, why are those big things empty, guys? When did they cease to matter? But all my life, when faced with this question, this what do you want to know moment, I always somehow went right to this. Teach me to love, wise ones. Why are we all so alone? In Jim's shack, my eyes moved across all those waiting eyes. A board in the fire pit popped. I cleared my throat. What the hell happened to Buffalo? I said. They sized me up and looked at each other, and then they started talking. This group I had stumbled upon, in fact, was none other than the secret society of the Buffalo Brain Trust. Though if you ask them, they will surely deny it. They first started meeting at the old Swanee Inn nearby, the pub from which Jim takes his nickname, and where, before moving to the shack, he could be found most evenings grousing about the wooden boat he was building. The Brain Trust guys had spent their lives living and working in Buffalo, and they knew a thing or two about it. And that meant they knew a lot about a lot of things. It seems that once you understand Buffalo, by simply adjusting the names and locations and substituting commodities once made or exchanged, you could understand most cities in most places. You would know why the Rust Belt was rusty and how the general state of chaos in the world was, in most ways, utterly predictable. They could have told me themselves if I had asked them 10, 20, 30 years ago that what rises will fall, and the ones with the real power were always 10 steps ahead of it, having already gotten rich off the ruins the rest of us were living in. This is true not only in post-industrial Rust Belt America, but all over. Understand Buffalo, and you can see with complete clarity the future of places that were presently booming, like China, which had boomed once already, but that was 2 centuries before. Like North Dakota, which was at that exact moment booming with gas and oil, not rusting at all. Check back with North Dakota in 20 years, they assured me, and I would find a new Silo City. I would find Derrick City. I would find Decay. none of this was hard to grasp if properly explained. So I'll stop there, and I will invite you to grill me or school me. Tell me what you know about Buffalo and the silos. Ask anything you like. Curious to know. I know some of you are from Buffalo. Yep.
I used to live in Buffalo in the sixties. And if you ever been close to this, they're huge. They're main. And you mentioned watching Buffalo Bills game. I was there when they built the stadium, but before they got to the park, we talked about the nothing silent. Cost they mentioned. They didn't build it there.
I imagine it would take a nuclear bomb to take them. I mean, it's like there's so many of them.
It is a beautiful spot. I mean, it's waterfront property.
Yeah.
It's just gorgeous.
Right, and therefore valuable, right? Well, we'll see, maybe in 2022. I know Glens Falls is, there's a lot of high-end housing that's gone up here, and people are like, really, people are gonna pay for high-end housing in Glens Falls, but I mean, yeah, it's a beautiful place right in the Adirondacks, so Buffalo, if they put high-end, expensive river condos up by.
Yeah, what is this down?
So his name is Rick Smith, and he owns a third-generation owner of a rigidized metal corporation, and he is now looking for the answer because he appreciates the history and the beauty of them, but he's a businessman. He wants to make money. So there's a restaurant, there's a wedding venue. The climbing wall didn't pan out for some reason. They were going to do, a lot of downtowns, yoga studios, condos. It's kind of a formula. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody puts in an aquarium someday. That's like the other thing people tend to do to bring back downtowns. But Rick, who's not pictured here, I wish I brought his picture. And apparently he's going to put it in housing. See how that goes. Spend some big money off it.
Couple of things. When I lived in Buffalo, I was a duster in one of the flour mills. I dust the whole floor and the sifters. When I was done, I'd start over again. Very explosive. But when I was there, you could light a match to the Buffalo River. And now they have cruises on it since you've been there. And they've got condos, restaurants, bars. Second thing Buffalo is doing is there are a number of Frank Lloyd Wright homes. And they're using Buffalo as an architectural destination. And it's really probably only second to Chicago. And another thing which always frosts me is Frederick Law Olmsted's second major commission was Buffalo, New York, after Central Park. And they never acknowledged it. And it's a beautiful parkway system with roundabouts. Buffalo DPWs restored most of it. So they're trying to make themselves as an architectural destination. And another thing kind of amusing, most friends I have from Buffalo all live in Florida. A lot of your photographs, it was always overcast. There's always a cloud over Buffalo, like Syracuse. That's got a kick out. I think you had two with clear skies.
Yeah, people really say that winters there. I mean, I was there in September and it was still nice, and I would say to people like, here it gets cold here in the winter, and their faces would go like, you don't understand. Like it was a city to rival Paris the way they designed it, because it was that important. Even though it was in a place nobody actually would have chosen to live because it's so cold. It was really built, as you say, it is, it was an important city with important architecture and design. It's really something, but when the industry went away, people were used to be there.
Well, I married this guy from Buffalo. And over the years, over the years, the times that we would go back there, I've seen that city change. It's so delightful to go back. And there's so much going on there. It's just really vibrant.
I'm an arts person, and I know that these industrial places would never have existed if for poetry. But now that they're there, they don't know what else to do with it. The arts that have come into them, just like, hey, we know what to do with this. They project movies on the walls and stuff. They do some really fun things. And I just enjoyed the creativity there. Just like really unpretentious, beautiful, creative stuff going on. It makes it so fun to be there.
One last thing, he won't tell you this, but his father was the last grain broker. The last.
Grain broker in
Grain
Buffalo,
broker
yeah.
in Buffalo.
So we have two Buffalonians here.
Yeah.
Is that what you guys would say?
I'm from there, I'm from around Erie.
Okay,
You're
well,
next.
Gary, did you say Gary?
Yeah, we've been here there.
Yeah, I've been there, steel mills, amazing. But our two Buffalo people, well, maybe not by coincidence, it was advertised as a great, great how to talk, but I mean, I think if you think about it, people connected to the grain industry, people from Buffalo are connected to it. That was, and I don't think most people understand. I think people think of Buffalo as an industrial city, meaning what electricity was made there from Niagara Falls. I don't think people really can put their finger on what industry made Buffalo grow. Pittsburgh's a steel town. People don't generally understand what Buffalo is about, which is strange to me. It was so huge for this.
Bethlehem Steel, that was the second biggest plant
Yeah.
in Lackawanna. And they closed down, that's just the way you have to.
Yeah, well, yeah, the steel mills are another thing. I have my Pittsburgh section of, I was saying, I think I was talking to somebody before the talk, and I was saying that the two places I think were most interesting to me were Buffalo and Pittsburgh, because I thought I knew a little bit about Pittsburgh, but I had no idea. Small towns around Pittsburgh that were steel mill towns that are so ruined. I mean, there's no steel being made there, so these towns have no reason to be there, but people still live in them, and that's what's really hard to see. And I went through West Virginia and it's the same way. It's like they're not pulling coal out of the hills the same way they used to. Much better, more livable environment for people, but they have no jobs. It's tough to see.
I did not live in Buffalo, but 25 years ago, I used to go there on business a lot. I fell in love with it. I love Buffalo, and I always rooted for it, because it just seemed as though they were, just getting bad breaks all the time. But everything these folks have said, the architecture, the people are just wonderful people, very midwestern in terms of their graciousness and kindness and things. I'm curious, so part one, I love Buffalo and I look forward to going back there just to visit sometime. But I'm curious, beyond Buffalo, where did your travel take you and what did you
Well,
find?
thank you for asking. Keep you here 24 hours to tell you all about it. I went up the Erie Canal, and this was definitely a trip that was guided by a lot of kismet, like just a lot of really lucky steps that I made. But it started to occur to me that you almost can't, if you get off the highways, you almost can't stumble into like the history of the industrial history of the country. It's all around. After Buffalo, it just made sense on the map to go into the Allegheny Mountains, and I went to Oil City and Titusville in Pennsylvania, and that was incredible. I mean, like, it should look like Dubai there now. It was the first oil strike in the world, the first wells. That's where Rockefeller made his billion. That's where Standard Oil got, where the oil came from. But it's just this little town in Pennsylvania. And then I went down to Pittsburgh. I went over to Akron. I love Cleveland, but I really wanted to know about Akron because, I mean, if people make fun of Cleveland, it's like, why would you want to live in Cleveland? It's actually a pretty cool little city, but Akron, I mean, come on. But actually, Akron's a pretty cool little city, and the tire making industry and the story of all of that is really fascinating to me. Do you know that a Ford and a Firestone married? It's like peanut butter and chocolate. Like to have a Ford person and a Firestone family person marry, it's like a royal wedding. But anyhow, all the things I learned in life. I traveled into the Midwest. I went into Missouri. I went through farm country. All those little small towns, like American's apple pie, but empty now because stores can't continue to exist when there's a Walmart, not there away. So anyhow, I did all that. I drove Wisconsin breweries, looked at breweries, Missouri, and then I went back through Kentucky and West Virginia and Maryland. And there's so much more to see, but basically it was kind of a rust belt early industry. And then beyond that, you go into the West and there's other mining and other things that you could write about. But that's all I needed to see. Yes, over here.
When you're investigating these, did you ever get any information on how the answers got all that cement in there?
Yeah, right? How did they pour all that cement? That's a lot of cement.
Did it come by water or the land? Another building involved.
That's a really good question, and I've never come across that. What is cement? Cement is like sand and lime and water. And so they must have dug pits somewhere.
I don't think there would be that much available with the city being right there basically on top of it. That's a lot of whatever removed.
So somewhere not too far, somewhere along the edge of one of the Great Lakes probably is an enormous crater where they dug out the sand, right?
Possibly.
I mean, but that's exactly it. Like one thing always begets some other thing, right? So that's a really good question. So I'll see if I can ferret it out.
But when you mention Buffalo being cold, I don't think of it being cold, I think of it as lake effect snow. Because the lake freezes over. It's like, a plateau, the first land to get off Lake Erie, and it just gets buried.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think of it as cold, I think of it as snow. And the other thing is, I was trying to look it up here to see if you could, YouTube. The CBS Sunday morning show, just had a feature, I think that's what it was on CBS anyway, about Duluth and their grain elevators, and they raised tons of money, and they painted them the most beautiful sky blue,
Awesome.
and then put sunflowers on them, and portraits of some of the native Americans who live in it.
Oh, that's
But it's gorgeous. And the people just got so invested in this project.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, it's an opportunity to be truly creative. There, you might come across a picture of, was it Labatt's? Or maybe it was Bud Light, a beer can that's blue. They painted one of the elevators, the silos in one of the elevators, like a big tall boy six pack, because that's what they would do.
Sunflowers, you got beer.
I think the sunflowers would be my preference, but I mean, they put a Bud Light logo on the roof, they could. But I think that's amazing. I've never been to Duluth, and my family's from Wisconsin and out that way, so I would really love to go up there. It's a great city, but also, a Great Lakes port city that's, I simply didn't understand, and I feel so much better now that I do understand how much of the country, the big cities that we know, that we think of as the major cities in this country, are along the lake edges, and if not along the lake edges, then they were railroad hubs or river towns, Pittsburgh's on the rivers, because everything was water transport. It seems like really obvious once you know it, right? But until you understand it, you don't really understand, like, why does the country look like it looks? Like, if nobody wants to live in Cleveland, why is there a Cleveland? I don't understand. It all makes sense, but it's not how it gets explained. That people find out.
We were in Buffalo, were they lighting up some of the silos at the time? Or was that more recent? Maybe they weren't doing it, but one of the sections, they threw a light show.
That would be amazing.
And it was good.
That sounds amazing. It happened to be the 200 years to the day marking the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812.
Yeah.
So there were big ships in the harbor, Buffalo Harbor, and there was fireworks display and stuff. We felt like that was important, that I had arrived in Silos City on the anniversary of the battle on Lake Erie. We still don't know why it was important, but it felt very important. I really, I read a lot about those guys, and I have not been back to visit them, nor have I brought them the book. I feel shy to do it. I really, really enjoyed it. They're just a bunch of guys who sit around and talk. I mean, I'm sure Rick Smith, who owns Silo City, I'm sure he's a man of means, but he puts on his white cowboy hat and sits with Swanee Jim and drinks Budweiser. That's how he spends his evenings, They're just a really great bunch of guys who taught me a lot about the city. I would love to go back there, but it's so far away. It's just so far away.
It's Toledo, right?
Toledo, not Duluth.
Yes.
Oh,
It
that's
says C-
wonderful.
if you search for CBS Morning Painted Silos, you get Toledo.
Good for Toledo.
Another, you should look it up.
Another underappreciated place, right?
I didn't know the difference between Toledo and Duluth, so there you go.
Well,
Probably about 5, 6 in the morning.
Hey, I have really enjoyed chatting with all of you. Thanks for coming out in the snow. I could give my book away to you. I cannot. I would be happy to sell it cheap. If you're interested, no pressure. Just that's the thing we writers do.